The Bureau of Educational and Culture Affairs of the U.S. Department of State fosters mutual understanding between people of the United States and the people of other countries to promote friendly and peaceful relations. It accomplishes this mission through academic, cultural, sports, and professional exchanges that engage youth, students, educators, artists, athletes, and rising leaders in the United States and more than 160 countries. A wonderful example of someone accomplished in this field is our speaker today, Lauri Fitz-Pegado. Lauri Fitz-Pegado is experienced in commercial and cultural diplomacy. An international executive, she has advised over 20 countries on normalizing diplomatic relations, international trade issues, crisis management, and development. Fitz-Pegado has always been passionate about the creative arts and international affairs. In international affairs, Lauri served in the Clinton administration's Commerce Department as Assistant Secretary and Director General of the Foreign Commercial Service under the leadership of Secretary Ronald Brown. She promoted U.S. exports, advocated for U.S. companies competing for market share, and supported commercial diplomacy through leading and managing a network of 90 offices in the U.S. and 130 globally. Earlier in her career, she was a Foreign Service officer in the Dominican Republic and Mexico. In the arts, Lauri established critical life skills, studying dance at the Jones Hayward School of Ballet in Washington, D.C. Currently, Fitz-Pegado advises the Dance Institute of Washington, teaches ballet at Jones Hayward, advises and coordinates programs for instructors and students of color at several dance schools in Washington. Lauri is a published author, and I'll show you her book. Her memoir, Dancing in the Dash, My Story of Empowerment, Diplomacy, and Resilience, has received rave reviews. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Vassar College, she has an MA degree from Johns Hopkins University's School for Advanced International Studies. She speaks Spanish and Portuguese. Her children and grandchildren live and work in Scotland, Angola, and Mozambique. Let us welcome Lauri Fitz-Pegado, author, dancer, and diplomat. Hello,
John, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. I don't have to talk anymore. You told my whole story. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to Don, Rebecca, and Mal, and thank you to the library for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and for all of you who have decided to tune in. I will talk a bit about my perspective on cultural and commercial diplomacy because I feel passionately about those dimensions of foreign affairs and foreign policy that sometimes don't get the attention of some of the other areas. But I've been on that journey for quite a while. And I will first talk about the definition of cultural and commercial diplomacy according to the scholars. And the use of a country's cultural and economic influence to persuade other countries to do something rather than the use of military power. A persuasive approach to international relations typically involving the use of economic or cultural influences. Coined by Nye in the late 1980s, the term soft power, the ability of a country to persuade others to do what it wants without force or coercion, which often is understood as one component of a state's broader public diplomacy. specifically to start with the concept of cultural diplomacy. It's a designated policy field in which states seek to mobilize their cultural resources to achieve foreign policy goals. It's the deployment of a state's culture in support of its foreign policy goals, regarded in many countries as a subset of the practice of public diplomacy. A government's communication with external audiences in order to positively influence them. So I'd like to start with the concept of cultural diplomacy and why it's important. And let me start out by saying, I'm sure many of you who are in the field and very familiar with cultural and commercial diplomacy and with foreign affairs and the Foreign Service know that the Foreign Service Act establishes not just the Department of State as a foreign service agency, but also a few other agencies. One is the Foreign Agricultural Service. Another is the U.S. Agency for International Development. Another is the Foreign Commercial Service. And back in the day, and I'm dating myself, I actually entered the Foreign Service as a U.S. Information Agency officer. So all of us are equal Foreign Service officers, but it seems that the Department of State, because it's the largest and understandable, and the one that's often out front, and most ambassadors who are career ambassadors come from the Department of State. But I will say, I am proud to say that when I was Director General of the Foreign Commercial Service, it was under the leadership of Ron Brown and myself that we had the very first Foreign Commercial Service officer appointed as an ambassador. There have subsequently been a few, as well as those from the Foreign Agricultural Service, and probably a few more from the U.S. Agency for International Development. So in talking about cultural diplomacy, I think people know that State Department officers engage in consular work, political affairs, economic affairs, that they are kind of at the core of the development of our foreign policy in the government. I like to think that our foreign affairs and our foreign policy comes from a broader swath of agencies, those that are foreign service and those that are not, comes from international non-governmental organizations who are on the ground and who are engaged in development, comes from the private sector that often contributes a great deal to policy through advocacy and through their work in the commercial arena. And also today from advocacy groups, trade associations who actually end up, quote unquote, lobbying or advocating for certain policies in the international sphere. They are engaged in lobbying in Congress and also the administration. I also at one time was very much involved in advocacy and in the lobbying area. And then of course there's social media today, which definitely provides a major source of information globally, quickly, commentary, very opinionated. And those perspectives also contribute to influencing the direction of policy, being able to measure how it's going through polling and through really just tracking what people are saying. So in that regard, let me talk about a few traditional or historical ways that cultural diplomacy has influenced policy, which all of you will remember, I'm sure, but sometimes we don't think about cultural affairs and cultural diplomacy having such an influence on world affairs. I will mention just a few to jog your memory. The Fulbright program, for example, established in 1946, educational exchange, international education to promote peace and understanding. How many Fulbrights do you know? And how many of these folks have contributed through their work overseas in education and exchange to really explaining who Americans are, to engaging in communities, and to being in multicultural environments. Another that I will say that, you know, people may not think of as cultural diplomacy, but I think they consider themselves in terms of how they define themselves, is actually cross-cultural communications through the Peace Corps. That the Peace Corps was established by Sarge Schreiber with the objective of actually having people in the communities interacting, cross-cultural communications that he believed was going to make for better relationships with countries around the world, and actually exposure and getting into people's communities and lives to better understand them. Goodwill ambassadors in arts, in culture, in sports. How are goodwill ambassadors foster increased understanding globally? Our jazz ambassadors. It was actually Adam Clayton Powell who thought that we should actually send out some of our musicians in the jazz genre because it is such a homegrown art form that so many countries of the world admire, and they're jazz artists from all over the place, even though jazz started in the United States. The whole concept of cultural diplomacy has expanded in the last 20 years to embrace subsets of cultural diplomacy. I'll call them, they probably don't consider themselves subsets at all, but their own specific areas of diplomacy, and that's sports diplomacy. You will all remember ping pong diplomacy with the Chinese. You will definitely remember, for example, Dennis Rodman and his coaching in North Korea. Very controversial, but a real sense that there were very few Americans who had even been in North Korea and had any type of relationship with the North Koreans. So that basketball diplomacy under the area of sports diplomacy became something interesting, which now is happening on a much larger scale with NBA professional team in now in Africa. There are NBA players and those who are not in the NBA, but who are on a professional track, who end up playing ball in many countries in Europe and other places in the world. We look at soccer and how global it is. We look at so many things. Soccer probably because we play it all over the world, whereas football, American football, is not played all over the world. We have rugby. So when you look at how sports has crossed borders and how it has provided opportunity for intercultural exchange and for understanding other cultures and societies. We have an American, Sixto Rodriguez, a musician who influenced the surge of anti-apartheid music in South Africa because of his original music that dealt with some of these issues. You remember We Are the World, that was the compilation of American musicians really singing and collecting funds for African famine relief. So I like to look at some of this as opportunities to engage in what is critical in my mind to foreign policy and good foreign affairs, international affairs, and that is cultural competence. If we are to understand and to develop policies with other countries, with other races, ethnicities, people who speak other languages, really to be global in our thinking and understanding, my view is that we need to improve our cultural competence skills. And when I say cultural competence, I am referring to the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems that are different from our own. It's been a key aspect of psychological thinking and practice for some 50 years. That is how I view the importance of cultural diplomacy and how it needs to be better integrated into our whole development of foreign policy. And I will say that my international career actually started in that realm at the U.S. Information Agency, which no longer exists. The U.S. Information Agency was created to tell America's story abroad. Some of you may think of the Voice of America, which you're very familiar with, which is an example of cultural diplomacy by providing music, radio, commentary, et cetera, to countries around the world, particularly was important when it was still the Soviet Union and when we were dealing with countries that did not have access to freedom of information in Cuba, in Russia, in what were the former Soviet republics and now independents, how this has contributed to people being aware of information. So I started my career as an intern at the Voice of America, at the U.S. Information Agency, where I worked in the Spanish language branch, working on identifying news blurbs, which we called actualities, which had to be cut from the reel to reel tapes. Back in those days, you had to splice them. And I would splice them and I would transcribe them. And when the Spanish language reporter came in the afternoon, they would then take those actualities, which I had selected, I hope well, and integrate them into the news broadcasts. I also gave tours of the Voice of America. There was a wonderful tour there back in those days that talked about the influence of Voice of America on the world and what was done there, and had actual audio of some of the programs. And I worked in the Public Information Office. So from there, I ended up becoming a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Information Agency. And I served 2 tours, one in the Dominican Republic in cultural affairs, and one in Mexico in information affairs. And I will, I hope, a little bit later show you some photos of my time in the Dominican Republic, where I actually performed with Ballet Santo Domingo. Talk about getting engaged in cultural affairs. I was right in the heart of it by performing with the ballet company in the Dominican Republic. And that was encouraged by my ambassador and by my colleagues, because I was a cultural affairs officer. And that allowed me to really get into the Dominican culture scene by actually continuing. I had been a ballet trained dancer all of my life, and I was able to continue that for 2 years, which was wonderful. That was my moonlighting job after being at the embassy all day and dealing with people like Zubin Mehta from the New York Philharmonic, who came there on tour. I took them the whole Philharmonic around the country of the Dominican Republic and Mexico. It was Alvin Ailey and some other arts groups. Also, I worked in with television crews from the United States and from Mexico when they were covering issues, for example, border issues and other hot political issues. So there are many ways that we can use multimedia and the arts to tell stories and to engage people in understanding each other. I will now move over to the concept of commercial diplomacy. So I spent my very early career in cultural diplomacy. I was a career officer. I did leave the USIA before it became part of the State Department. So as Don introduced the Bureau of Education Affairs, et cetera, that used to be part of the U.S. Information Agency. It is now part of the State Department, because there was a merger between USIA and state. State took over USIA, and then it became the part of the State Department called the public diplomacy area of the State Department. I think it's been a bit diluted there, that having a separate agency focused on all of these issues would have been my preference, but who am I? And I was no longer there when that happened. There are still the same programs that were at USIA and more. Wonderful educational exchange, speaker programs. There are still the media related parts of our government, Voice of America, international broadcasting, all of those things are still there. They are part of the State Department now. So I started as a career diplomat. I left and I was in the private sector in public affairs and many things, but I came back into government with my friend Ron Brown, who had been friend, colleague, mentor. I was very much involved in Democratic politics with Ron before he became chairman of the party. And during campaigns, particularly the Clinton-Gore campaign, I was one of the directors of the Clinton-Gore inaugural committee under Chairman Ron Brown at that time. And then did a lot of work with Ron when he was chairman of the DNC, the first African-American chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and did a lot of foreign travel. And he believed, even when he was chairman of the DNC, that engaging the private sector and traveling to countries and meeting with the communities, going into communities always when he traveled, meeting with politicians from both sides or many sides of the aisle. In most countries, of course, they've got multiple parties. He met with the opposition figures, he met with the current governments, with business, with arts and culture, because he believed in the integrative approach and holistic approach to relationships between the US and many other countries. And he carried that over into the Commerce Department when he became Secretary of Commerce. He did not coin the term commercial diplomacy. It's been around for a while, but he definitely implemented it and expanded it, and really used it as the core of his approach as Secretary of Commerce to international affairs. People are not too aware, I don't think, of the expanse of the Commerce Department, how many agencies are there. It's one of the largest departments in the US government, covering everything from the weather, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, where my dad retired from Commerce only 2 years before I was sworn in as an assistant secretary, which was really quite special. It has the Economic Development Agency, it has the Minority Business Development Agency, the International Trade Administration, so many parts that deal with very disparate issues, but they all converge very much under this concept of commercial diplomacy. The offices that I ran in the United States, 90 of those offices were spread throughout the country. They were located in business centers primarily, and sometimes in capitals of states. And those people in those centers were civil servants. They served in those communities, they knew the business community, and their focus was on small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. It so happens that export-related jobs are the highest paying in our country. And exports, particularly during that time, the Clinton administration contributed greatly to our growth, export-led economy. So the people who are in those offices, running those 90 offices in the States, are advising smaller companies that don't have the resources of larger multinational companies to engage in foreign markets, to find markets for the export of their widgets, for a better term, whatever the product is. So the foreign offices, those 130 during my time, were in many countries of the world, where if you were in Iowa and you had a new widget, or you were doing domestic production, but you wanted to export, you could go to the Commerce Department's Export Assistance Center, consult with them, and they would then be in contact with the office in Germany, in Brazil, in South Africa. They would help to find the most appropriate market for your product, and then they would facilitate finding an agent distributor, giving you advice about regulatory issues, actually booking you, if it was available, on a trade mission to those countries. So that was a wonderful, it's a wonderful service that still exists in our government, that many companies don't know about, that many people don't use, but is a reasonably priced way for the US government to actually help in getting businesses overseas and expanding their markets. We also at Commerce engaged in a great deal of advocacy for large companies. When a Boeing was competing with an Air France in some country of the world, where there was a contract that was going to be awarded, and it was the Americans competing against the French or whomever, the Commerce Department developed under Ron Brown an advocacy mechanism for the US government to support that American business, and to put all of its resources through the embassy, the ambassadors, the commercial officers, the economic officers, all the people on the ground, to help that American company to have a support base with that foreign government, so that there would be an even playing field. And many contracts were won during that time. It continues, the advocacy efforts for US business. And this also, the engagement of the private sector with governments, with private companies abroad, with public companies, enhances our ability to pursue our international policies and to have support outside of governments specifically, hopefully with the governments, but also the private sectors can be drivers, US and companies in those countries. So the concept of commercial diplomacy, of taking Americans, which Ron did and still happen on trade missions to countries, is a very, very important practice. And we cannot underestimate the importance of business, the private sector, in developing relationships and in pushing policy many times on the trade front, on the regulatory front, in trade agreements, for example, and the importance of international trade agreements. When it comes to sanctions being imposed, we have to have our companies on board when the US imposes sanctions. There are many companies that will oppose those sanctions, to engage in the dialogue, in the debate that helps to make our policy better. So those are my thoughts about cultural and commercial diplomacy. What I would like to do is now, so that you won't be too bored, to actually show you some pictures that reflect some of the things that I have talked about here. If I'm able to share my screen and pull up this PowerPoint. Don, can we see this? Is it on the screen, Don? Hello?
It is on the screen.
Okay, great.
Rebecca here. It's on.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you so much. I'm glad it's on the screen. I think that relationships and history and families are so important. My mom and dad, my dad, in addition to being a Commerce Department retiree, was an actor. And understanding the importance of passion and profession has been very important in my family. And as I mentioned to you, I also studied ballet from the time I was 5. So the family as the first important part. These are my kids and my grandkids. This one's in Scotland, Brianna. The ones in the middle, one of my grandsons and my son lives in Angola and is in the fossil fuel business. And my daughter to the left, Luena, is in Angola, where she is engaged in public affairs for a major US company as well. These were the dance teachers who exposed me early on, school in Washington, D.C., exposed me to ballet because there were very few schools in this country where children of color could study ballet. And they opened one in Washington, D.C., which is still there. And I actually teach there now that I'm in the second phase of my life. I retired 4 years ago from international affairs and trade and lobbying and all of those things. Arthur Mitchell, who you may have heard of, was the founder of the Dance Theater of Harlem, the first Black ballet company in the United States, danced with the New York City Ballet, traveled all over the world. George Balanchine was the creator, a Russian who really transformed ballet in this country and dance. There's another example of cross-cultural, intercultural, cultural diplomacy in many ways. I performed with a company here in Washington, D.C., the Capitol Ballet, which traveled to many of the historical Black colleges and universities in the United States, performed at inaugurations, all kinds of things. Don mentioned that I went to Vassar. I performed with Vassar Dance Theater, even though my dad would not let me major in dance. He made sure that I engaged academically, not that dance isn't a mind game too, but I did study languages. My major was Hispanic studies, and my master's at Johns Hopkins was in international economics and Latin American affairs. Examples of cultural diplomacy. I mentioned to you that I danced with the Ballet Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic as my moonlighting job. During the day, I was dealing with cultural affairs. This was, I was on detail to Panama when Torrijos was the president. I have a funny passage in my book about my experience with Omar Torrijos. I also, in Mexico, worked under the former actor. Talk about cultural diplomacy. John Gavin, if you remember him, became the ambassador to Mexico. So having that right side of the brain and the left side of the brain functioning can actually build bridges across the world. In the commercial diplomacy area, I found that Jesse Jackson was somewhat underappreciated as a commercial diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, getting people, negotiating for people to be released from prison in some very difficult countries in the world. This was a trip in Africa where he actually, in 1986, took academics, people from the private sector, we went to 7 countries in Africa and met with every president in each country, with political leadership and with the business community. And he talked about how trade and investment was important to development of foreign policy. Ron Brown, whom I've talked about, was a friend, was a mentor, a wonderful Secretary of Commerce, a wonderful DNC chairman, and a very good friend to Bill Clinton, as you all will remember. And I know there's a Clinton connection right there. where the library is located. And I just wanted to read one quick passage here about Bill Clinton and Ron Brown, which a lot of people don't know. But Ron Brown died in a plane crash in 1996, tragically, with 33 other people. It was really quite terrible. It was the only trip I had not been on with him in the last 6 months of his life, because my people on the ground, as I mentioned, in these 130 offices around the world were sometimes the primary people on the ground for all of his agenda and his trips. But I will read this quick passage called from chapter 5 of the book. On April 10th, 1996, President William Jefferson Clinton delivered a stirring eulogy at the National Cathedral for Ronald Harmon Brown, a man who had become his dear friend, became his Secretary of Commerce, and who on a government plane with 35 others had lost his life in service to the nation while on a trade mission to war-torn Croatia and Bosnia. President Clinton called Ron an incredible life force who loved success, was always so kind to people without regard to their station in life, and a man who had lived a truly American life. He said Ron Brown was so daring that he, a man of African-American heritage, would compete for the chairmanship of the Democratic National Committee and against all the odds, win the position, becoming the first African-American to head that organization, and then go on to get him elected president. To put no finer a point on his words, Bill Clinton said, there were only two people who believed he could be president at the outset of his quest, his mother and Ron Brown. I thought I was at that ceremony at the National Cathedral in honor of Ron, celebration of his life, when I heard Bill Clinton say that, and I just had to include that in the book. Also, on my many, many travels, I was able to meet many heads of state and many people who were extremely impressive, but I think the most impressive to me always has been Nelson Mandela. And we had the pleasure of meeting with Mandela when he had only been out of jail for a few months in 1990. A trade mission example of us on a flight going to a country, and then the very tragic plane crash. And this was what was left of the plane that crashed on St. John's Mountain in Dubrovnik. And I was sent, I was in Vietnam, opening a new office in Vietnam, the first since the war, a commercial office, when I was asked to fly to Croatia and to oversee the recovery of the bodies and to fly home with the caskets to Dover, Delaware. I was asked by the White House and by Alma Brown and the family, very good friends. And of course, I couldn't say no, but that was quite life-changing for me. And then some of the people who have really understood commercial and cultural diplomacy, even at the State Department. And here's Colin Powell, who always invited in and understood that synergy and the importance of the USAID and the Foreign Agricultural Service and the Foreign Commercial Service. And Jack Kemp there, who also was very much engaged in diaspora activities at the Constituency for Africa, and Mel Foote there, who runs the Constituency for Africa. So, so these are, I've just flipped through some of the, I'm now the first ballerina, Black ballerina to compete internationally in Varna, and in Moscow twice was Sandra Fortune Green, who was trained, we were trained together at Jones Haywood. And now we work together teaching children at Jones Haywood. That's a picture of Sandra now. I teach there as well. Some other, as Don said, Dance Institute of Washington, I've been engaged in a group of students from across Washington, D.C. of color who are in ballet, because we believe that ballet is such an important core with characteristics that are transferable to any profession you are in terms of the discipline, performance, ability, resilience, presence. All of those things are so important. And I believe that the arts can be at the core of forming all of those foundational things that can ensure that you have a life that is successful and that you have the skill sets that you need. And so I'll end with that and ask that I try to respond to any of your questions.
Wow, Lauri, what a tour de force from I think of the sports diplomacy in North Korea to the Peace Corps, and even the issues that you raise in bringing dance around the world. And in fact, under the Google Scholar, when I was looking this up, this field that we're talking about today, there was a heading which said dance and decolonization in Africa. And to my surprise, the French government supports 44 bureaus in Africa working towards this, trying to continue some form of relationship with these countries after they've lost their colonial powers. So looking at that, I was intrigued by the idea that given the number of African Americans in America, the United States, did the Department of Commerce specialize in certain countries, such as Africa or other countries, in the choosing of places to put to the offices that you were in charge of?
That's a great question, Don. I will say that these offices were all over the world. Back at that time when we were at Commerce, which was in the 90s, I was there from 93 to 97. We engaged in expanding and opening some new offices in what we call the big emerging markets. And one of those were places such as we opened a new office in China, in Brazil, in South Africa, to name one of the African centers. There had never been an office in South Africa, and that was a time when Mandela had become president by then. And we opened a hub office, and also the sanctions had been lifted, that against South Africa, the sanctions were lifted. We had first trade mission to South Africa and opened a commercial office there that served as a hub for Southern Africa. We did open new offices. We had an East Africa hub and a West Africa hub. North Africa, there had been offices in the past. And we also opened offices in all the former Soviet republics where there had not been offices. So it wasn't limited to Africa. There was a great expansion all over the world. We opened an office in Indonesia, the very first. So there was a special place that Ron Brown had in terms of making sure that people understood that Africa matters. He gave speeches about why Africa matters and why commercial relationships with Africa and actually return on investment in Africa was higher than in most countries of the world. And people did not realize that because of infrastructure problems and lots of other issues, human rights and other things that still plague the world, but somewhat after decolonization and independence in many of these African states. These were concerns, regulatory framework, infrastructure, et cetera. So he did make a special effort and did travel to Africa quite a few times.
Wonderful. The other question I had in mind listening was, you mentioned somewhat the relationship between trade and State Department, for example.
Mhm.
And I come from Canada. Most people know that by now in this organization. And at one time, under more business-oriented governments in Canada, the Trade Department was actually made superior to our equivalent of the State Department, the Department of Foreign Affairs. And so that swung the balance into commerce rather than the State Department. And I wondered if you had some thoughts under what I understand in the last presidency, many appointments in the State Department in America were not made. And some of the, we had speakers talk to us about that, the decimation of state as importance in America under that regime. So it's topical, and I just asked your, having been in both, what you think. Who should be boss?
Well, I think there should be a comprehensive, holistic approach to all of our foreign policy. It should be inclusive. I don't think there should be hegemony at all. I don't think one area should be more important than others. I think we should work together. And I actually see it happening in so many countries. It's really the leadership of the ambassador. In every country, there is a country team, quote unquote. It consists of the multiple agencies US agencies that are present in that particular post or in that country. And the ambassador sets the tone. If in the meetings, the ambassador acknowledges and insists that people share information and work together, for example, the economic officer and the commercial officer. When there is no commercial officer in a post, the economic officer takes on those responsibilities. However, the training of economic officers and commercial officers are quite different, because a commercial officer must have a minimum, I don't know what it is these days, back in my days, I think it was 7 to 10 years of private sector experience in order to become a foreign commercial officer. So we wanted them to come in with experience and knowledge of the private sector, how it works, how businesses work, et cetera, because we thought they could be more effective. Whereas the economic officers are more policy driven than actual hands-on experience. So I think, Don, even though the Canadians may have put trade first, and I could cheer for them, I'm going to say that I think it should be all integrated and everybody should work well together. And by the way, Don, I am now doing work with the National Ballet School of Canada. And this is on cross-cultural issues of dance, ballet, diversity, all of those things. So I'm enjoying my time being in Toronto and them being here. We have some students coming here from Toronto from that school at the end of October. So I'm still in that intercultural business.
Cross-cultural, yes. Mal, if you unmute yourself and allow your screen. You may ask a question, because then we'll open it up to the general audience.
Absolutely. This is really terrific, Lauri.
Thank you.
The question I have, because you covered so much territory and your career is so broad, when you think about what you did in the world of foreign affairs, what stands out to you as this is the thing that really was important, really made an impact, and we should do more of?
That's a hard question, because I really feel so privileged to have been engaged in so many countries of the world, both in government and in the private sector, because all of my private sector work has been with countries as well, most of it. I think that what I would put my hand on, and I won't name a specific country, but I will say that in all of my work, both public and private, I pride myself on having had the opportunity to be exposed and to work with heads of state, foreign ministers, trade ministers, and to have maintained in my mind the integrity of what I believe was important to share with them about our country. I think that many times deals go bad, trade agreements, foreign policy goes bad, so to speak, because people don't understand how the US works, the division of powers, the politics, the partisanship, how communities feed in, the diversity of our country, the different thinking. So I have been able to, through advice and counsel, when people say, what do you mean you represented countries? What does that mean? Well, it means different things. Sometimes it was on trade issues. Sometimes it was on establishing diplomatic relations. But what I think is so important is being able to explain our country to those foreign countries so that they will better understand how we work, how we think, why we do the things we do, and how they could move more effectively throughout all the aspects of our body politic and our community in order to reach their objectives, if those objectives were reachable. Because I've also told many leaders of countries that I'm not sure that's possible unless there are certain things done in your own country first. So I think that candor and that ability to be at the table with some of these very important people in the world has been what I consider to be a privilege and something that I will always remember.
That's pretty terrific. That is pretty terrific. It's such a broad field that you've covered, broader than most of the topics we tend to cover from month to month. I'm trying to distill in my own mind, where's a place where we could find something that our audience would say, I see where that is, I see where that fits, I see where that makes an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Help us come through that, because it is so important and yet so broad and in some ways so diverse.
Mm-hmm.
We need to focus. We need to focus even Don, with his breadth of interest and coverage. What should we be focusing on? What should we walking away from this terrific session with that says, that's a place I could put my mind around.
Mm-hmm.
I could put my attention to, and I could think, God, that's worth spending time and effort with.
Oh, wow. You're giving me some tough questions now.
But that's my job.
I can tell you what I have decided to do with my time now that
Yes, that's good.
and that might be able to help people to focus. As I said, I feel very privileged. Excellent family support, excellent education, wonderful career paths, as you all have seen. But now what I want to do, and as I said, I retired 4 years ago, but I call it retiring, tiring. I have putting on new tires. I'm not actually sitting back doing nothing. But what I've decided to do is to apply all of that professional experience, including the dance, into passion projects that I think make a difference. So the projects that I'm engaged in have to do with mostly younger people, bringing them into the sphere of the arts, particularly dance, having them understand and exposed across borders. As I mentioned to Don, I work with a group of students from 5 different dance institutions in Washington. And we are engaged in dialogue and student exchanges and teacher exchanges with the National Ballet School of Canada. So to have these young people have the opportunity to travel to Toronto into a culture, it's not so far away, but into a very different cultural setting. To have them dance, take classes with Canadians, to have even in Washington, students who don't know each other because they're from 5 schools and they all come from marginalized communities. Almost all of them are of color. To have them exposed to a South African dance teacher who performs with or performer at the National Ballet of Canada. Sipe November from South Africa. His story is amazing how he came from a township in South Africa and then ended up in the National Ballet of Canada. So I've shown the children the film about Sipe's journey, about what's possible, about how there are not barriers in art, that there are no barriers. It's a global language, the arts of dance, of music, of all of these things. And it builds bridges. It builds understanding. It's going to help to make our global community better, to have this type of cross-cultural and multimedia and multicultural. So that's what I would say to people to take away from this, that we can integrate art, sports, commerce, business into our better understanding of the world and of people, and therefore maybe we won't have so many problems moving forward.
One question coming from the audience is, in the subtitle of your book is Empowerment, Diplomacy, and Resilience. And if you showed us some pictures of your family, so I feel somewhat free to ask the question that you've talked about diplomacy. What about the other 2 issues? Are you free to talk about empowerment and resilience?
Well, I think that as an African-American woman who grew up in the 50s, 60s, still growing up now in the 2020s, that I lived through a very critical time in our history, which was desegregation. I integrated schools as a young girl. And I do compare myself in the book, or someone compared me, and I was taken aback. I speak about that in one of the chapters, to Ruby Bridges, the young woman who is in the Norman Rockwell painting of a little Black girl in a white dress, carrying a notebook, walking into a very hostile crowd to integrate school in New Orleans. I had to walk into very hostile environments in my life. I was the only Black person, Black woman, Black girl in schools, in junior high school. In high school, I went to a predominantly white college, Vassar College. I entered the Foreign Service back in the 70s. There were very few African-American women in the Foreign Service. I was engaged, as you know, in politics with Ron Brown. I was the first Black Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Director General. My foreign commercial service consisted of predominantly white males. And so I have been in white spaces all of my life. I have had to navigate those spaces well. That's the empowerment part. And that's also the resilience part. And I speak of resilience also in terms of the skill sets I learned through the arts, because they helped you to build resilience. Ballet is not easy. It can be very painful with those little shoes that you stand on point and you squeeze your feet into, bleeding toes and all kinds of things. So I think that having a tolerance for pain and learning to bounce back, to be resilient in spite of the challenges that you face, That's what that subtitle means.
Well, I have 4 daughters, and all have had successful careers, but they were in the white class, as it were, and so didn't face some of your empowerment and resilience issues that you've raised. But all of them have had other problems in their way through the business world and other worlds that they competed in. And I admire my 4 daughters, and I admire you, and I admire your talk to us today. And I'm so pleased that a friend of yours, whose name I haven't quite figured out, at the Columbia University or University of New York, wrote to us and said, you just got to have this woman on your program because she's great. And you are great. And I thank you on behalf of Chappaqua Library and your listeners and watchers. And I hope that this mal-induced whatever approach to the rest of your life goes swimmingly as your career has gone. Thank you. Thank you, Lauri, for being with us.
It's an honor and a privilege to have been with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauri, on behalf of the library. We've been doing this program for 2 decades, and we continue to learn. We hope to grow. We continue to spread our coverage into different aspects of a world which we never thought we would do 20 years ago. If you thought of a group of people, men and women, maybe a dozen, clustering in one corner of the library at Chappaqua, trying to get our hands around the subject, we would never have been able to say, we can talk to people in any part of the world at any time using the technology and using the support of the library and the support of the library staff to get our discussion with, our understanding of. So we really appreciate your help. We appreciate the library's help. In 2 weeks, we'll be back again, running a different program. I can't tell you what that will be because our world keeps changing as well as yours, but we will be back in 2 weeks. Rebecca, it's nice to see you on occasion. Ms. Joan will be back to do her magic work and talk about all the other wonderful things that are happening at the library. And so until then, thanks to all of you. Have a wonderful time. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay sane if you can. Keep plugging along. Thanks a lot.